Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 3 of H.G. Wells's The Open Conspiracy. Beginning with chapter 10, the open conspiracy is not to be thought of as a single organization. It is a conception of life out of which efforts, organizations, and new orientations will arise. This open and declared intention of establishing a world order out of the present patchwork of particularist governments, of effacing the militarist conceptions that have hitherto given governments their typical form, and of removing credit and the broad fundamental processes of economic life out of reach of private profit-seeking and individual monopolization, which is the substance of this open conspiracy to which the modern religious mind must necessarily address its practical activities, cannot fail to arouse enormous opposition. It is not a creative effort in a clear field. It is a creative effort that can hardly stir without attacking established things. It is the repudiation of drift, of leaving things alone. It criticizes everything in human life from the top to the bottom and finds everything not good enough. It strikes at the universal human desire to feel that things are all right. One might conclude, and it would be hasty, unsound conclusion, that the only people to whom we could look for sympathy and any passionate energy in forwarding the revolutionary change would be the unhappy, the discontented, the depressed, and the defeated in life's struggle. This idea lies at root of the class war dogmas of the Marxists, and it rests on an entirely crude conception of human nature. The successful minority is supposed to have no effective motive but a desire to retain and intensify its advantages. A quite imaginary solidarity to that end is attributed to it, a preposterous base class activity. On the other hand, the unsuccessful mass proletariat is supposed to be capable of clear apprehension of its disadvantages. And the more it is impoverished and embittered, the clear-minded it becomes, and the nearer it draws its uprising, its constructive dictatorship, and the millennium. No doubt a considerable amount of truth is to be found in this theory of the Marxist revolution. Human beings, like other animals, are disposed to remain where their circumstances are tolerable and to want change when they are uncomfortable. And so a great proportion of the people who are well off want little or no change in present conditions, particularly those who are too dull to be bored by unprogressive life, which a great proportion of those who actually feel the inconveniences of straitened means and population pressure do. But much vaster masses of the rank and file of humanity are accustomed to inferiority and disposition. They do not feel these things to the extent even of desiring change, or even if they do feel these disadvantages, they fear change more than they dislike their disadvantages. Moreover, those who are sufficiently distressed to realize that something ought to be done about it are much more disposed to childish and threatening demands upon heaven and the government for redress and vindictive and punitive action against the envied fortunate with whom they happen to be in immediate contact, than any reaction towards such complex, tentative, disciplined, constructive work as alone can better the lot of mankind. In practice, Marxism has found to work out and ready resort to malignity, destructive activities, and to be so uncreative as to be practically impotent in the face of material difficulties. In Russia, where in about the urban centers at least, Marxism has been put to the test, the doctrine of the Workers' Republic remains a unifying cant, a test of orthodoxy, of as little practical significance there as the communism of Jesus in communion with Christ and Christendom, while beneath the creed a small oligarchy which has attained power by its profession does its obstinate best, much hampered by the suspicion and hostility of the Western financiers and politicians, to carry on a series of interesting and varying successful experiments in the socialization of economic life. Here we have no scope to discuss the NEP and the 5-year plan. They are dealt with in the work, wealth, and happiness of mankind. Neither was properly communistic. The 5-year plan is carried out as an autocratic state capitalism. Each year shows more and more clearly that Marxism and communism are divagations from the path of human progress, and that line of advance must follow a course more intricate and less flattering to the common impulses of our nature. The one main strand of truth in the theory of social development woven by Marx and Engels is that successful, comfortable people are disposed to dislike, obstruct, and even resist activity, any substantial changes in the current patchwork of arrangements, however great the ultimate dangers of that patchwork may be, or the privations and sufferings of other people involved in it. The one main strand of error in that theory is the facile assumption that people at a disadvantage will be stirred to anything more than chaotic and destructive expressions of resentment. If now we reject the error and accept the truth, we lose the delusive comfort of belief in the magic giant, the proletariat, who will dictate, arrange, restore, and create. But we clear the way for the recognition of an elite of intelligent, creative-minded people scattered through the whole world, the whole community, and for a study of the method of making this creative element effective in human affairs against the massive oppositions of selfishness and unimaginative, self-protective conservatism. Now, certain classes of people, such as thugs and burglars, seem to be harmful to society without a redeeming point about them, and others, such as racecourse bookmakers, seem to provide the minimum of distraction, and entertainment with a minimum of mischief. Willful idlers are a mere burden on the community. Other social classes, again, professional soldiers, for example, have a certain traditional honorableness which disguises the essentially parasitic relationship of their services to the developing modern community. Armies and armaments are cancers produced by the malignant development of the patriotic virus under modern conditions of exaggeration and mass suggestion. But since there are armies prepared to act coercively in the world today, it is necessary that the open conspiracy should develop within itself the competence to resist military coercion in combat and destroy armies that stand in the way of its emergence. Possibly the first two types here instance may be condemned as classes and excluded as classes from any participation in the organized effort to recast the world, but quite obviously the soldier cannot. The world commonweal will need its own scientific methods of protection, so long as there are people running about the planet with flags and uniforms and weapons offering violence to their fellow men and interfering with the free movement of commodities in the name of national sovereignty. And when we come to the general functioning classes, landowners, industrial organizers, bankers, and so forth, who control the present system, such as it is, it should be still plainer that it is very largely from the ranks of these classes and from their stores of experience and tradition of method that the directive forces of the new order must emerge. The open conspiracy can have nothing to do with the heresy that the path of human progress lies through an extensive class war. Let us consider, for example, how the open conspiracy stands on such a complex of activities, usages, accumulations, advantages as constitutes the banking system. There are no doubt many bankers and many practices in banking which make for a personal or group part of that banking world follows routine and established usage. It is carrying on and keeping things going. And it is neither inimical nor conducive to the development of a progressive world organization of finance. But there remains a residuum of original and intelligent people in banking or associated with banking or mentally interested in banking who do realize that banking plays a very important, interesting part in the world's affairs, who are curious about their own intricate function and disposed towards a scientific investigation of its origins, conditions, and future possibilities. Such types move naturally towards the open conspiracy. Their inquiries carry them inevitably outside the banker's habitual field to an examination of nature, drift, and destiny of the entire economic process. Now the theme of the preceding paragraph might be repeated with variations through a scope of paragraphs in which appropriate modifications would admit it to the industrial organizer, the merchant and organizer of transport, the advertiser, the retail distributor, the agriculturalist, the engineer, the builder, the economic chemist, and a number of other types functional in the contemporary community. In all, we should distinguish firstly a base and harmful section, then a mediocre section following established usage, and lastly an active progressive section to whom we turn naturally for developments leading towards the progressive world commonweal of our desires. And our analysis might penetrate further than the separation into types of individuals. In nearly every individual instance, we should find a mixed composition, a human being of fluctuating moods and confused purposes, something sometimes base, sometimes drifting with the tide, and sometimes alert and intellectually and morally quickened. The open conspiracy must be content to take a fraction of a man as it appeals to fractions of many classes if it cannot get him altogether. This idea of drawing together a proportion of all or nearly all the functional classes in contemporary communities in order to weave the beginnings of a world community out of their section is a fairly obvious one, and yet it has still to win practical recognition. Man is morbidly gregarious and partisan creature. He is deep in his immediate struggles and stands by his own kind, because in so doing he defends himself. The industrialist is best equipped to criticize his fellow industrialist, but he finds the root of all evil in the banker. The wage worker shifts the blame for all the social wrongs in the employing class. There is an element of exasperation in most economic and social reactions, and there is hardly a reforming or revolutionary movement in history which is not essentially an indiscriminate attack on one functioning class or type upon another, on the assumption that the attacked class is entirely to blame for the class and the attacking class is self-sufficient in the commonweal and can dispose with its annoying collaborator. A considerable element of justice usually enters into such recriminations. But the open conspiracy cannot avail itself of these classes animosities for its driving force. It can have, therefore, no uniform method of approach. For each class, it has a conception of modification and development, and each class it approaches, therefore, at a distinctive angle. Some classes, no doubt, it would supersede others. The scientific investigator, for example, must be regarded as wholly good and seek only to multiply and empower, but it can no more adopt the prejudices and extravagances of any particular class as its base than it can adopt the claims of any existing state or empire. When it is clearly understood that the binding links of the open conspiracy we have in mind are certain broad general ideas, and that except perhaps in the case of scientific workers, we have no current set of attitudes of mind and habits of activity which can turn over directly and unmodified to the service of the conspiracy, we are in a position to realize that the movement we contemplate must from the outset be diversified in its traditions and elements and various in its methods. It must fight upon several fronts, and with many sorts of equipment. It will have a common spirit, but it is quite conceivable that between many of its contributory factors, there may be very, very wide gaps in the understanding and sympathy. It is no sort of simple organization. Chapter 11, Forces and Resistance in the Great Modern Communities, now prevalent, which are antagonistic to the open conspiracy, the war with tradition. We have now stated broadly but plainly the idea of the world commonweal, which is the objective of the open conspiracy. And we have made a preliminary examination of the composition of that movement, showing that it must be necessarily not a class development, but a convergence of many different sorts of people upon a common idea. Its opening task must be the elaboration, exposition, and propaganda of this common idea. A steady campaign to revolutionize education and establish a modern ideology in men's minds, arising out of this, the incomparably vaster task of the realization of its ideas. These are tasks not to be done in a vacuum. They have to be done in a dense world of crowding, incessant, passionate, uncoordinated activities, the world of market and newspapers, seed time and harvest, births, deaths, jails, hospitals, riots, barracks, and army maneuvers, false prophets and royal processions, games and shows, fire, storm, pestilence, earthquakes, and war. Every day and every hour, things will happen to help or thwart, stimulate or undermine, obstruct or defeat the creative effort to set up the world commonweal. Before we go on to discuss the selection and organization of these heterogeneous and mainly religious impulses upon which we rest our hopes of a greater life for mankind, before we plan how these impulses may be got together into a system of coordinated activities, it will be well to review the main antagonistic forces with which, from its very inception, the open conspiracy is now in conflict. To begin with, we will consider these forces as they present themselves in the highly developed Western states of today and in their American derivatives, which, in spite of the fact that in most cases they have far outgrown the lands of origin, still owe a large part of their social habits and political conceptions to Europe. Although states touch upon the Atlantic or its contributory seas, they have all grown to their present form since the discovery of America. They have a common tradition rooted in the ideas of Christendom and a generic resemblance of method. Economically and socially, they present what is known in current parlance as the capitalist system. But it will relieve us of a considerable load of disputatious matter if we call them here simply the Atlantic civilizations and communities. The consideration of these Atlantic civilizations in relation to the coming world civilization will suffice for the present chapter. Afterwards, we will consider the modification of the forces antagonistic to the open conspiracy as they display themselves beyond the formal confines of the now defined states in the world affairs, in the social systems weakened and injured by their expansion, and among such less highly organized communities as still survive from man's savage and barbaric past. The open conspiracy is not necessarily antagonistic to any existing government. The open conspiracy is a creative organizing movement and not an anachronistic one. It does not want to destroy existing controls and forms of human association, but either to supersede or amalgamate them into a common world directorate. If constitutions, parliaments, and kings can be dealt with as provisional institutions, trustees of the coming age of the world commonweal, and insofar as they are conducted in that spirit, the Oba Conspiracy makes no attack upon them. But most governments will not set about their business as in any way provisional. They and their supporters insist upon a reverence and obedience which repudiate any possibility of supersession. What should be an instrument becomes a divinity. In nearly every country of the world, there is indifference to the pretended necessities of a possible war, a vast degrading and dangerous cultivation of loyalty and mechanical subservience to flags, uniforms, presidents, and kings, or president or king who does his appointed work well and righteously is entitled to as much subservience as a bricklayer who does his work well and righteously and to no more. But instead, there is a sustained endeavor to give him the privileges of an idol above criticism or reproach, and the organized worship of flags has become, with charged conditions of intercourse and warfare, an entirely evil misdirection of the gregarious impulses of our race. Emotion and sentimentality are evoked in the case of disciples and cooperations that could quite easily be sustained and that are better sustained by rational conviction. The Open Conspiracy is necessarily opposed to all such implicit loyalties and still more to the aggressive assertion and propaganda of such loyalties. When these things take the form of a suppressing reasonable criticism and forbidding even the suggestion of other forms of government, they become plainly antagonists to any comprehensive project for human welfare. They become manifestly, from the wider point of view, seditious, and loyalty to the king country passes into plain treason to mankind. Almost everywhere at present, educational institutions organize barriers in the path of progress, and there are only the feeblest attempts at any counter-education that will break up these barriers. There is little or no effort to restrain the aggressive nationalist when he waves his flag against the welfare of our race, or to protect the children of the world from the infection of his enthusiasms. And this last is as true now of the American system as it is of any European state. In the great mass of modern community, there's little more than a favorable acquiescence in patriotic ideals and in the worship of patriotic symbols, and that is based largely on such training. These things are not necessary things for the generality of today. A change of mental direction will be possible for the majority of people now without any violent disorganization of their intimate lives or any serious social economic readjustments for them. Mental infection in such cases could be counteracted by mental sanitation. The majority of people in Europe and still larger majority in the United States and other American republics could become citizens of the world without any serious hindrance of their present occupations or without any incalculably vast increase of their present security. But there remains a net of special classes in every community, from kings to custom house officers, far more deeply involved in patriotism because it's their trade and their source of honor, and prepared in consequence with an instructive resistance to any reorientation of ideas toward a broader outlook. In the case of such people, no mental sanitation is possible without dangerous and alarming changes in their way of living. For the majority of these patriots by meter, the Open Conspiracy unlocks the gates leading from a fussy paradise of eminence, respect, and privilege, and motions them towards an austere wilderness which does not present even the faintest promise of a congenial, distinguished life for them. Nearly everything in human nature will dispose them to turn away from these gates, which opens toward the world peace, to bang to and lock them again if they can, and to grow thickets as speedily as possible to conceal them and get them forgotten. The suggestion of being trustees in a transition will seem to most of such people only the camouflage of an ultimate degradation. For such classes of patriots, by meteor, it is manifest that the Open Conspiracy can expect only opposition. It may detach individuals from them, but only by depriving them of their essential class loyalties and characteristics. The class, as a class, will remain none the less antagonistic. About royal courts and presidential residences and diplomatic, consular, military, and naval circles, and wherever people wear titles and uniforms and enjoy pride in precedences based on existing political institutions, there will be the completest general inability to grasp the need for the Open Conspiracy. These people and their womankind, their friends and connections, their servants and dependents, are fortified by time-honored traditions of social uses, of sentiment and romantic prestige. They will insist that they are reality and cosmos a dream. Only individuals of exceptional liveliness, rare intellectual power, and innate moral force can be expected to break away from the antagonistic habits such class conditions impose upon them. This tangle of traditions and loyalties, of interested trades and professions, and of privileged classes and official patriots, this complex of human beings embodying very easy and natural and time-honored ideas of eternal national separation and unending international and class conflict, is the main objective of the open conspiracy in its opening phase. This tangle must be disentangled as the open conspiracy advances, and until it is largely disentangled and cleared up, that the open conspiracy cannot become anything very much more than a desire and a project. This tangle of necessary patriots, as one may call them, is different in its nature, less intricate and extensive proportionally in the United States and the states of Latin America than it is in the old European communities, but it is nonetheless virulent in its action on that account. It is only recently that military and naval services have become important factors in American social life. And the really vitalizing conflict of the interested patriot and the state has hitherto centered mainly upon the custom house and the concession. Indeed, instead of a mellow and romantic loyalty to king and country, the American thinks simply of America and his flag. The American exaggeration of patriotism began as a resistance to exploitation from overseas. Even when political and fiscal freedom were won, there was a long phase of industrial and financial dependence. The American's habit of mind, in spite of his recent realization of the enormous power and relative prosperity of the United States, and of the expanding possibilities of their Spanish and Portuguese-speaking neighbors, are still largely self-protective against an now imaginary European peril. For the first 3/4 of the 19th century, the people of the American continent, and particularly the people of the United States, felt the industrial and financial ascendancy of Great Britain and had a reasonable fear of European attacks upon their continent. A growing tide of immigrants of uncertain sympathy threatened their diseased habits. Flag worship was imposed primarily as a repudiation of Europe. Europe no longer looms over America with overwhelming intimations. American industries no longer have any practical justification for protection. American finance would be happier without it. But the patriotic interests are so established now that they can go on and will go on. No American statesman who ventures to be cosmopolitan in his utterance and outlook is likely to escape altogether from the raucous attentions of the patriotic journalist. We have said that the complex of classes in any country interested in the current method of government is sustained by traditions and impelled by its nature and conditions to protect itself against exploratory criticism. It is therefore unable to escape from the forms of competitive and militant nationalism in which it was evolved. It cannot, without grave danger of enfeeblement, change any such innate form. So that while parallel complexes of patriotic classes are found in greater or lesser intricacy grouped about the flags and governments of most existing states, these complexes are by their nature obliged to remain separate, nationalist, and mutually antagonistic. You cannot exhibit a world union of soldiers or diplomatists. Their existence and nature depend upon the idea that national separation is real and incurable, and that war in the long run is unavoidable. Their conception of loyalty involved an antagonism to all foreigners, even if foreigners of exactly the same type as themselves, and makes for a continual campaign of annoyances, suspicions, and precautions, together with a general propaganda affecting all other classes of the necessity of an international antagonism that creeps persistently toward war. But while the methods of provoking war employed by the patriotic classes are traditional, modern science has made a new and enormously more powerful thing of warfare. And as the Great War showed, even the most conservative generals on both sides are unable to prevent the gigantic interventions of the mechanician and the chemist. So that a situation is brought about in which the militarist element is unable to fight without the support of the modern industrial organization and the acquiescence of the great mass of people. We are confronted, therefore, at the present time with the paradoxical situation that a patriotic tradition sustains in power and authority warlike classes who are quite incapable of carrying on war. The other classes to which they must go for support when the disaster of war is actually achieved are classes developed under peace conditions, which not only have no positive advantage in war, but must as a whole suffer great dislocation, discomfort, destruction, and distress from war. It is of primary importance, therefore, to the formerly dominant class that these new social masses and powers should remain under the sway of the old social, sentimental, and romantic traditions, and equally important it is to the open conspiracy that they should be released. Here we bring into consideration another great complex of persons, interests, traditions, the world of education. the various religious organizations, and beyond these, the ramifying intermediate world of newspapers and other periodicals, books, the drama, art, and all the instruments of presentation and suggestion that mold opinion and direct action. The sum of the operation of this complex will be either to sustain or to demolish the old nationalist militant ascendancy. Its easiest immediate course is to accept it. Educational organizations on that account are now largely conservative force in the community. They are in most cases directly controlled by authority and bound officially as well as practically to respect current fears and prejudices. It evokes fewer difficulties for them if they limit and mold rather than release the young. The schoolmaster tends, therefore, to accept and standardize and stereotype even in the living progressive fields of science and philosophy. Even there, he has a break on the floor in movement. It is clear that the open conspiracy must either continually disturb and revivify him or else frankly antagonize him. Universities also struggle between the honorable paths on which their prestige rests and the need of adaptation to a world of inquiry, experiment, and change. It is an open question whether these particular organizations of intellectual prestige are of any real value in the living world. A modern world planned de novo would probably produce nothing like contemporary university. Modern research, one may argue, would be stimulated rather than injured by competing detachment from the lingering medievalism of such institutions, their entanglement with adolescent education and their ancient and contagious conception of precedence and honor. Ordinarily, religious organizations, again, exist for self-preservation and are prone to follow rather than direct the currents of popular thought. They are kept alive, indeed, by revivalism and new departures, which at the outlet they are apt to resist, as the Catholic Church, for instance, resists the Franciscan awakening. But their formal disposition is conservative. They say to religious development, thus far and no further. Here in school, college, and church are activities of thought and institution which, generally speaking, drag upon the wheels of progress, but which need not necessarily do so. A schoolmaster may be original, stimulating, and creative, and if he is fortunate and a good fighter, he may even achieve considerable worldly success. University teachers and investigators may strike out upon new lines and yet escape destruction by the older dawns. Universities compete against other universities at home and abroad and cannot altogether yield to the forces of dullness and subservience. They maintain a certain difference from vulgar opinion and a certain repute of intellectual virility. As we pass from the more organized to the less organized intellectual activities, we find conservative influence declining in importance and a fair play for the creative drive. Freshness is a primary condition of journalistic, literary, and artistic success. And orthodoxy has nothing new to say or do, but the desire for freshness need to be satisfied all too readily by merely extravagant, superficial, and incoherent inventions. The influence of this old traditional nationalist, social, and political hierarchy, which blocks the way to the new world, is not, however, exerted exclusively through its control over schools and universities. Nor is that, indeed, its most powerful activity. Would that it were. There is also a direct, less defined contact of the older order with the nascent powers that plays a far more effective part in delaying the development of the modern world commonweal. Necessarily, the old order has determined the established way of life, which is, at its best, large, comfortable, amusing, and respected. It possesses all the entrances and exits and all the controls of the established daily round. It is able to exact, and does exact, almost without design, many conformities. There can be no very ample social life, therefore, for those who are conspicuously dissident. Against the old order has a complete provision for the growth, welfare, and advancement of his children. It controls the fonts of honor and self-respect. It provides a mapped-out world of behavior. The new initiatives make their appearance here and there in the form of isolated individuals, here an inventor, there a bold organizer, or a vigorous thinker. Apart from his specific work, the innovating type finds that he must fall in with the established things, or his womenfolk will be ostracized, and he will be distressed by a sense of isolation, even in the midst of successful activities. The more intensely he innovates in particular, the more likely he is to be too busy to seek out kindred souls and organize a new social life in general. The new things and ideas, even when they arise abundantly, arise scattered and unorganized, and the old order takes them in its net. America, for example, both of its Latin and on its English-speaking side, is in many ways a triumph of the old order over the new. Men like Winwood Reade thought that the New World would be indeed a new world. They idealized its apparent emancipations, but as the more successful the toiling farmers and traders of Republican America rose one by one to affluence, leisure, and freedom, it was far more easy for them to adapt the polished and prepared social manners and usages of Europe than to work on a new civilization in accordance with their equalitarian professions. Yet there remains a gap in their adapted society. Henry James, that acute observer of subtle social flavors, has pointed out that the peculiar headliness of social life in America because of the absence of court functions to go on to justify the assembling and dressing. The social life has imitated the preparation for the court without any political justification. In Europe, the assimilation of the wealthy European industrialist and financier by the old order has been parallel and naturally more logically complete. He really has found a court to go on to. His social scheme was still undecapitated until kingdoms began to change into republics after 1917. In this way, the complex of classes vitally involved in the old militant nationalist order is mightily reinforced by a much larger mass of imitative and annexed and more or less assimilated rich and active people. The great industrialist has married the daughter of the Marquis and had a couple of sons in the guards and a daughter who was a princess. The money of the American Leeds, fleeing from the social futility of its land of origin, helped bolster up a mischievous monarchy in Greece. The functional and private lives of new men are thus at war with one another. The real interests of the great industrialist or financier lie in cosmopolitan organization and the material development of the world commonweal. But his womenfolk pin flags all over him, and his sons are prepared to sacrifice themselves and all his business creations for the sake of trite splendors and Rivitanian romance. But just so far as the great business organizer is capable and creative, so far is he likely to realize and resent the price and frustration that the old order obliges him to pay for amusement, social interest, and domestic peace and comfort. The open conspiracy threatens him with no effacement. It may even appear with an air of release if he had women who were interested in his business affairs instead of women who had to be amused, and if he realized in time the practical, intellectual, and moral kidnap of sons and daughters by the old order that goes on, he might pass quite easily from acquiescence to antagonism. But in this respect, he cannot a single-handed. This is a social and not an individual operation. The open conspiracy, it is clear, must include in its activities a great fight for the souls of economically functional people. It must carve out a society of its own from society. Only by the creation of new and better social life can it resist the many advantages and attractions of the old. This constant gravitation back to traditional uses on the part of what might become a new social types applies not merely to big people, but to small people as are really functional in the modern economic scheme. They have no social life adapted to their new economic relations, and they forced back upon the methods of behavior established for what were roughly their analogs in the old order of things. The various sorts of managers and foremen in big modern concerns, for example, carry on ways of living they have taken ready-made from the stewards, tradesmen, tenantry, and upper servants of an aristocratic territorial system. They release themselves and are released almost in spite of themselves, slowly, generation by generation, from habits of social subservience, that they are no longer necessary nor convenient in the social process, acquire an official pride in themselves, and take on new conceptions of responsible loyalty to a scheme. And they find themselves under suggestions of class aloofness and superiority to the general mass of less cardinal workers that are often unjustified under new conditions. Machinery and scientific organization have been and still are revolutionizing productive activity by the progressive elimination of the unskilled worker, the hack, the mere toiler. But the social organization of the modern community and the mutual deportment of the associated workers left over after this elimination are still haunted by the tradition of lord, the middle class, tenant, and the servile hand. The development of a self-respect and mutual respect among the masses of modern functional workers is clearly an intimate concern of the open conspiracy. A vast amount of moral force has been wasted in the past 100 years by the antagonism of labor to capital, as though this were the primary issue in human affairs. But this never was the primary issue, and it is steadily receding from its former importance. The ancient civilizations did actually rest upon a broad basis of slavery and serfdom. Human muscle was the main source of energy, ranking with sun, wind, and flood. I think it means wood there. But invention and discovery have so changed the conditions under which power is directed and utilized that muscles become economically secondary and inessential. We no longer want hewers of wood and drawers of water, carriers and pick and spade men. We no longer want the breeding swarm of hefty, sweaty bodies without which in the former civilizations could not have endured. We want watchful and understanding guardians and drivers of complex, delicate machines, which could be mishandled and brutalized and spoiled all too easily. The less disposed these masters of our machines are to inordinate multiplication, the more room and food in the world for their ampler lives. Even at the lowest level of fully mechanized civilization, it is required that the human element should be select. In the modern world, crowds are a survival, and they will be presently an anachronism. And crowd psychology, therefore, cannot supply the basis of a new order. It is just because labor is becoming more intellectual, responsible, and individually efficient that it is becoming more audible and impatient in social affairs. It is just because it is no longer mere gang labor and it is becoming more and more intelligent cooperation and detail that it is now resents being treated as a serf, housed like a serf and fed like a serf and herded like a serf, and its pride and thoughts and feelings disgraced. Labor is in revolt because, as a matter of fact, it is in the ancient and exact sense of the word ceased to be labor at all. The more progressive elements of the directive classes recognize this, but as we have shown, these are formidable forces still tending to maintain the old social attitudes when arrogance became the ruler and the common man accepted a servile status. A continual resistance is offered by a large section of the prosperous and advantage to the larger claims of the modernized worker. And in response, the rising and differentiating workers develop an angry antagonism to these directive classes, which allow themselves to be controlled by their conservative and reactionary elements. Moreover, the increasing relative intelligence of the labor masses, the unexpected imaginative stimulation they experience, the continually more widespread realization of the available freedoms and comforts and indulgences that might be and are not shared by all in a modern state, develop a recalcitrance where once there was little but fatalistic acquiescence. An objection to direct and obligation, always mutually present in the toiling multitude since the economic life of man began, becomes articulate and active. It is the taste of freedom that makes labor desire to be free. This series of frictions is quite inevitable aspect of social reorganization, but it does not constitute a primary antagonism in the process. The class war was invented by the classes. It is a natural tradition of the upper strata of the old order. It was so universally understood that it was no need to state it. It was so universally understood that it was no need to state it. It is implicit in nearly all the literature of the world before the 19th century, except the Bible, the Quran, and the other sequelae. The class war of the Marxists is merely a poor snobbish imitation, a tu quo, a pathetic, stupid, indignant reversal of and a retort to the arrogance, a pathetic upward arrogance. These conflicts cut across rather than oppose or help the progressive development to which the open conspiracy devotes itself. Labor awakened, inquiring, and indignant is not necessarily progressive. If the ordinary undistinguished worker is no longer to be driven as a beast of burden, he has, which also goes against the grain, to be educated as to a high level of cooperative efficiency as possible. He has to work better, even if he works for much shorter hours and under better conditions, and his work must be subordinated work still. He cannot become an en masse sole owner and master of a scheme of things he did not make and is incapable of directing. Yet this is the ambition implicit in an excessively labor movement. Either the labor revolutionary hopes to cage the services of exceptional people without acknowledgement or return on sentimental grounds, or he believes that anyone is capable as anyone else, if not more so. The worker at a low level may be flattered by dreams of class conscious, mass dominion from which all sense of inferiority is banished. But there will remain dreams, the deep instinctive jealousy of the commonplace individual. For outstanding quality, a novel initiative may be organized and turned to sabotage and destruction masquerading as and aspiring to be a new social order. But that will be a blind alley and not the road of progress. Our hope for the human future does not lie in crowd psychology and the indiscriminating rule of universal democracy. The open conspiracy can have little use for mere resentment as a driving force towards its ends. It starts with a proposal not to exalt the labor class, but to abolish it. Its sustaining purpose is to throw drudges out of employment and eliminate the inept, and it is far more likely to incur suspicion and distrust in the lower ranks of the developing industrial order of today than to win support there. Just as everywhere else in the changing social complexes of our time, it can appeal only to the exceptionally understanding individual and who can, without personal humiliation, consider his present activities and relationships as provisional, and who can, without taking offense, endure a searching criticism of his present quality and mode of living. All right, these are rather long chapters, so we'll end it here. We'll end it at chapter 12, and make sure to tune in. Hello, Corbin, and hello, Hashima Wan. Make sure to tune in next week, same time, for part 4. Todd Lewis of the Praise of Life podcast, signing off.